let me ask you just to come along on more of a thinking journey. All of these slides are in your book, and then there's some additional slides if you want more information. Let me ask you just to take a moment and think about what you are and what you do as a leader. And as you think about that, define leadership. What is it? Is it different than management? A lot of books suggest that management is old school and leadership is new school. Interestingly, John Kotter, who was a professor at Harvard, and you probably know Kotter from his change management model that was produced in the early, mid-1990s. But in 1990, John Kotter wrote for the Harvard Business Review an article that probably was seminal in the sense that he said management and leadership are both important. And he said most organizations are overmanaged and underled. But he clearly said that both are needed. As I reflect upon your world in the ED, or the ER if you prefer, again, I've got 4 daughters and they all 4 tell me, Dad, nobody knows what an ED is. It's an ER for us lay people. Okay, that's fine. If you reflect upon your life there, a great deal of what you do is what I will refer to management. It's hour by hour, minute by minute, day by day. Fix it. There's a problem. Not a lot of it is leadership in the sense of, if you define leadership as visioning out toward the future. And that's not saying that what you do as a manager is bad and you're not doing enough leadership. What I'm trying to do here at the outside is kind of dispense with the idea that management is bad and leadership is good. You've seen those in books, right? You see it in the airport bookstore. So both are needed, both are important. So I started 1 year working in a glass plant, and then in 1974, in the summer of '74, Sister Mary George hired me when Claremont Mercy Hospital opened on the east side of Cincinnati. Any Ohio folks here, please? Thank you. Hi. And I don't get into Go Bucks or anything like that. My graduate degree was at Xavier, and they have not lost a football game since 1972. They haven't. They haven't played one since '72. Very good. Okay, so when I started with Sister Mary George, I started in human resources. And it wasn't until probably the last 10 or 15 years that I realized I basically, for the most part, including the 1 year in the glass plant, I spent my entire career trying to decipher leadership. What is it? What comprises leadership? What makes an effective leader? Are you an effective leader? I teach an online leadership course, and I start out by asking everyone to assign themselves on a scale of 0 to 100, their effectiveness in leadership. And I usually get everything from about 75 to 92, as you could probably guess. You know, most people lie when they fill those out. So, you know, we're all liars and thieves. How many of you can tell me you have never, ever even told a small lie? Anyone? How many of you can tell me you've never taken anything that didn't belong to you, including, you know, the hotel-issued pen? Anyone? Okay, I'm very comfortable addressing all of you as fellow liars and thieves. Simple as that. So, as I've thought about that, in the last 25 years until a year ago, I was a recruiter. And I was a recruiter with 3 firms. The last 9 or 10 years, most of my work was in the physician executive world. So I was constantly confronted meeting people and trying to make the determination, is she an effective leader? Can she go into this physician leadership position and be truly effective? And so I'm constantly asking this question, what is leadership? I like what Warren Bennis says. It's like beauty. It's hard to define, but you know it when you see it. I'll take that a step further. Some of you would assess him as a highly effective leader. I'm just picking on you. Some of you would say, no, he's not highly effective, he's pretty effective. And a couple of you might say, well, he's okay. I'm protecting you from the bottom third, which we eliminated before you came in this morning. So essentially, start with me now. Ask yourself again, what is leadership? And am I an effective leader? Just ask yourself that question a little bit. Several definitions, probably too busy to see on the slide. If you look down and you haven't had coffee, you'll snooze. Or if you need a CPAP, you'll snooze. So, but you folks, ED folks I don't have to worry about you. You know, Drucker, the famous Peter Drucker, the only definition of leader is someone who has followers. You can see the counter to that. Warren Bennis, who told us on the first slide, oh, it's like beauty. Ooh. He's saying it's the capacity to translate vision into reality. I just love that. And next time you're on a busy shift on the ED, realize that what you're doing is translating vision into reality. In a way, though, aren't you? Or Bill Gates, you know, Uncle Bill, as we look into the next century, leaders will be those who empower others. There's the counter to that. Others. Empowerment's a good thing? Well, yeah. I asked a group last week, I was working with a large faith-based organization. I had 38 physician leaders, and I asked the question, it's kind of risky in a faith-based organization, but I did it. Was Hitler an effective leader? Was Stalin an effective leader? Or last, John Maxwell, and Maxwell's become very popular. He has a little bit of a religious twinge, but he also has some very solid things to say. Leadership is influence, nothing more, nothing less. I love that. Okay, if you Google, what is leadership? Last week, I got over 2 billion. I had to stop. If you look at the Bible of leadership, Professor Ralph Stogdell, he presents in the first 350 pages essentially over 700 definitions of leadership. If I ask each of you to write your definition of leadership, and we collectively had the energy and the patience to listen to everyone's definition, which is, you know, we'd have to put something else in the vapor that you would be very dissimilar and very similar, but they all would be somewhat different. So if you actually joined me at the beginning and said, okay, I'll think about what is leadership and am I effective? Well, let me take you through a whole semester in the master's program at UAB. So this is, you're trying to get your MHA from University of Alabama, Birmingham. You're in the executive program, so you come for a week every 3 months for 2 years, every 4 months for 2 years. So you're stuck with me all day Saturday, all day Sunday, all day Monday, from 8 to 5, and then you're stuck with me for the rest of the semester online as we go through the rest of our material. So let me take you through the whole semester, or at least a third of that semester here. As leadership became an actual discipline to study, note that I say as it became, because it really didn't surface in the academic literature until the 30s or 40s. Most of what you saw in the academic literature was in engineering. It was Jonathan Taylor. It was academics writing about how do we manage factories in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And it viewed people as simply widget makers. As we went into the 30s and 40s, as you contemplate what leadership was, what do you know historically from your history way back? We're going into World War II. Even those who felt that in the 30s we could stay out of it, most knew we're going to get into it. So there was one core question. And it's a core question a lot of you ask and try to answer when you hire someone. If we're going to send young 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds to Europe, to the Pacific Rim, who should lead them? Because see, after World War I, we had the biggest drawdown of history, more so than the last 25 years. We decimated the military. And you only had people, which you know because you remember the movie Patton. You know, we had General Patton just chafing at the bit. Patton and a few others, oh, let's have a war, let's have a war. But the issue was, we basically cut our military by 65%. And a big part of what we cut was the leadership level. And so after World War I and into the 20s, those leaders went elsewhere except for a handful of George Pattons. So all of a sudden, we are faced with World War II, and our history books seem to tell us that the real issue was, can we get women out of the houses to go build tanks and bullets and put together sea rations? The real issue, folks, was leadership. Who's going to be a sergeant? Who's going to be a lieutenant? Who's going to be a captain? And so the academics began to move away from what initially at the top there, Aristotle is given credit to the great man theory, but in the late 1800s, early 1900s, the academics said, don't need to study it. Highly effective leaders are born that way. And perhaps you would ask and answer that question, are leaders born or are leaders made? I would answer that as both, quite frankly. Putting the watch there, hopefully I'll pay attention to it. If not, I know someone in the front row who will send me some signals. So as we entered the 30s and 40s, a lot of what we started to study were traits and styles. Some of you probably have heard the name Kurt Lewin. If you've taken some master's degree programs, the whole idea was people had certain styles of leadership. And many of you hold that kind of definition of leadership very preciously even today. Even though the evidence from an empirical standpoint suggests that styles alone don't have a high correlation to effective leadership. Because if you'll move down to Follett and Fiedler, the law of the situation, contingency leadership. So here's the question, show of hands. Is a participative leader the best leader? Always. Yes? No? Not sure? Not listening to you? Bored already? Is a highly participative leader always the most effective leader? It depends, right? Depends upon what? The issue? What else does it depend upon? Maturity of the organization? Other things it might depend upon? The urgency? The plane is crashing. Let's have a team meeting and talk about it. No, I want an autocratic George Patton. I want that pilot to take charge. I don't care if he went to a participative leadership conference that Delta sponsored last week. I don't want him to be confused by that. What else might leadership depend upon? The person or persons you're trying to lead, the followers. You know, They may need much direction. A physician right out of residency. Or a physician who probably needs to head toward that which falls on the other side of practice. You know what I mean. What else might it depend upon? So urgency of the situation, the maturity of the organization, the followers. Organizational issues like what? Are you in a growth mode? Are you in an area of declining population? Have you just been acquired by a larger health system? Or did you, the larger health system, just acquire several other hospitals, and so now you're cobbling things together, and you're in the flagship, and you're being ignored? Maybe it demands different kind of leadership. So this was a critical time. This was 1960s, 1970s in the academic world. And it surfaced in the popular leadership literature in the late 80s and early 90s. And it basically said, Blake and Mouton, some of you have seen that grid. It's the task versus the relationship with people. Then Hersey and Blanchard, you know him from the 1 Minute Manager. It's a situational theory. And then Terabom, another situational theory. And then with Burns in the late 80s, early 90s, and this is where we reach the end of the story, Burns said it's transformational. How many of you would like to be a transformational leader? There's at least 80% of you who are not engaged. So, Sherry, I'm going to come down off this X, and I'm going to walk the crowd like I normally do. I feel like I'm a bear confined up here at the X. So, if it's okay, it's okay. That's my problem, not yours. So basically, Burns said that the job of a leader was to transform. What's missing on that page? What's missing is Cotter. Management and leadership, which you agreed with me at the start. We need both. I think you agreed with me. You were more engaged with me then than you are now. So come on, folks. So click the slide, right? So in the late 90s, early 2000s, the last academic concept of leadership appeared, and it was called competency theory. And it was the whole idea that effective leaders had certain competencies. In some respects, it's no different than saying leaders need to adjust to the situation, adjust to their followers, adjust to the type of follower, adjust to the maturity of the organization, adjust to what's being demanded. But essentially, competency theory developed, and so a lot of other industries ran headlong into this in the 90s. By 2000, a lot of healthcare had caught up. And just to show hands, how many of you have some kind of a leadership competency model in your organization? That's not bad. What happened, though, was people like, I can't name them, but a very large Catholic healthcare organization developed their leadership competency list, and it had 88 competencies. A very well-known consulting firm, Lominger, developed a list that had 68 competencies. Another firm came up with 128 competencies. A very large multi-health system in the Midwest came up with 93. So in the early 2000s, as a recruiter, I was working with my clients and trying to think, you know, this competency idea is a good idea. Have any of you ever made a hiring mistake? Don't put your hands up. One person did. Okay, we have one truthful person, but I saw several faces. I then did catch you. Okay. Competencies, as a recruiter, I thought, if I can discern someone's leadership competencies, and I can match the competencies to the needs of the position in the organization, maybe I can increase my batting average. You know, as a recruiter, frankly, that's the best measure of quality you have. You know, after 3 years, are the leaders that you've helped your organization find still there? Are they doing well? A lot of recruiting firms will put guarantees on their placements. In some cases, I did CEO searches that had guarantees as long as 3 years. So, meaning, if the CEO left the job for whatever reason, voluntarily, involuntarily, I came back and did the search for free. In our industry, it's called a redo. It's not something you can kind of do in medicine usually, particularly in surgery. You can, but sometimes you can't. We hated redos. So our goal and our feeling of how do we measure our quality, you can measure satisfaction. Was the client happy with you? Probably every one of you have been candidates in some case or another with recruiters. How politely did the recruiter treat you? How frequently did he or she get back to you? So you can measure that satisfaction. But you know, at the end of the day, it's that sticking factor that I think is the real quality. So does the leader who's placed stay in the job? And then you could argue very appropriately, well, does he or she do what's needed? That's important as well. So I felt competencies could help me, but can you imagine if you told me, find me a new residency program director for the emergency residency? Okay, I can deal with that. I've done those. And so I'm sitting across from you and I say, okay, we've talked about the residency and we've talked about some of your goals in the residencies. Now let's talk about what you'd like to have in your program director. Tell me the leadership competencies you want. And I tell you what, I've got a list of 68. Would you like to go through them? No way. You know what you say to me? I say, what do you want? Well, I want an effective leader. Great, I know exactly what that means. I've got 700 definitions. I'll use them. So I politely say, well, I know you want a good leader. I know you want a highly effective leader, but what does that mean? What does highly effective leadership mean to you? So a lot of you, most of you, I'd say 80% of you would, in the top 3, you'd say, I want an effective communicator. And so I would just politely say, what do you mean by that? And it would be at this point, now the nurse leaders in this room might be a little more patient with me. The physician leaders in this room would be a little less patient with me. I told you I wanted an effective communicator. You know what it looks like, just go find one. Well, no, I don't. Do you mean written communication, oral communication? And the answer is yes. Okay, do you mean somebody who can be persuasive? Yes. So I'm at least starting to put a little detail to what you mean when you say, I want an effective communicator, Carson. Go recruit one for me. And we've just spent 5-6 minutes on that, okay? So now I'm saying, well, what else would you like? And you're thinking, I wish I'd called another recruiter. And you're saying, well, I want a team builder. Okay, good. Do you have teams now? Well, of course. Well, when you say team builder, what do you mean? Well, team builder. Well, what is a team to you? And if I even get you to say, some of you might say, a team is where there's a George Patton type person in charge and everybody else does what he or she tells them to do. Okay, that helps me. That helps me better understand what you're after. But see, now I'm only on the second competency and I've got 66 more to go. You see my dilemma? So Dr. Andy Garman, who at the time was the vice chair of the health administration program at Rush University. Andy is now the CEO of National Center for Healthcare Leadership. Andy and I had been friends for a long time. And I called Andy and I said, you know, I'm struggling with this. And he laughed. He said, I am too, because the academic literature doesn't have a lot on it. And I said, well, let's study it. which meant, Andy, why don't you and your graduate students study it, and I'll sit in the car with you. And essentially that's what we did in 2003, 4, and 5. And so we essentially came up with a model of leadership, which I'm going to share with you here. So it took us all this time to get up to this point. Sorry about that. The competency theory, either the big ones with 68 or 128, or the one that Andy and I worked on and developed, which has only 16 competencies, lets leadership be seen. I know it when I see it. I can look at someone and watch them over a period of time, observe their behavior, and I can essentially describe to you their effectiveness as a communicator, as a team builder, as a visionary, as someone who's a good listener, right? But see, interestingly, in the interview situation, people are on their best behavior, so you may only have a short amount of time to assess those. But at least the competency model, from a definitional standpoint, lets leadership be seen. The second bullet, and this is what Andy and 3 of his graduate students did, essentially validated this model against academic research. And then we went out to other search people, we went out to other leaders, we had a number of physician execs in this as well, and kind of probed their insight in terms of competencies. The third for us, for me in particular, it was usable. There wasn't 128, there wasn't 68. You'd stay with me if there were 16, and I'll show you shortly how we translated the 16 into 4. It targets what we felt was the exceptional leader. What were the key competencies that really set the great leaders apart? It gives an objective definition, better understanding. It makes assessment more objective. In my opinion, folks, one of the single greatest tasks you face as leaders is assessing other people. Think about it. Assessing other people. Their strengths, their weaknesses, their competencies, their ability to grow and develop. It helps with leadership development. And then finally, one of the things I found, physician leaders love it because I'm not spouting out some kind of leadership theory. So the model, if you need it distilled into 4, the model's pretty simple. The model has 4 cornerstones. So if you look on your top left, well-cultivated self-awareness. Folks, I will argue with you until I die. If you don't have a strong self-awareness, that will limit your leadership ability. If you are perceived as sexist, sorry, you're sexist. Perception, more often than not, is more important than reality. If you're perceived as racist, you're racist. 21 years in 4 hospitals, I learned this so well, so clearly. So a self-awareness, a well-cultivated self-awareness, which also gets into the whole area of emotional intelligence. So that's the top left quadrant. So I would argue, if you're trying to enhance your leadership effectiveness, one of the first things you should do is to seek out some input about how you're perceived. Seek input from people who will tell it to you like it is. See, most of the time, they won't tell you directly like it is. They'll soften it. They'll polish it. Because you have in your hand the power of economic capital punishment. You can fire them. If you can't fire them, if you're in one of those environments where it's tough, you can make life miserable for them. I was with somebody 4 weeks ago who told me a story. I said, "Is this true?" He said, "Yes." He was in an academic health center in the 1990s, and he had a director who'd been in that organization for 25 years or so and was horrendous. But for a variety of reasons, all of this director's prior superiors had ignored him and given him essentially vanilla performance appraisals. This director said, I ultimately fulfilled his destiny and it got him out of the organization by telling him, I'm moving you into a new position. And the new position, he put him in a room with no phone and no window. It sounds like solitary confinement. And he asked this person, without the use of a computer, to study patient records by zip code and categorize them in any way that he wanted to categorize them. He didn't say, I want to know how many patients in this zip code came through with this diagnosis. He said, you just explore on your own. And he said, I'm not cutting your pay. You know, I need you in this role. And he said, after 5 months, the guy took another job. And it sounds a little like a fairy tale, but interestingly, as you think about it, how many people will really give you an honest opinion of yourself? So sometimes, some of you have used 360s where the results go to a neutral third party, they're aggregated, and then they come back to you, and in theory, you don't know who said what. That's a better source of input than simply calling everyone together in a team meeting and saying, you know, I went to a meeting in Las Vegas and I learned that I needed to enhance my self-awareness. I realize I'm certainly not all the leader that I could hope to be, and I'd just like to sit here today. We've got an hour. Could you give me some input on how I could be a more effective leader? Can you imagine, with most of you, the silence in the room? Now, some of you will have that person who will say, well, you know, boss, if you could just help us understand the vision a little more clearly of the organization. That's safe. That's safe. It's easy for me to tell you that, because then you can say, well, it's my boss. But top left, well-cultivated self-awareness. Your bottom left, compelling vision. Now, a lot of leadership is really looking out into the future. A lot of your topics, interestingly, as I went through the next couple of days, are very leadership focused, looking out beyond the day-to-day grind you're in. See, sometimes when people are too busy managing, they don't have the ability to look out into the future. And so they're so busy on that hamster wheel, that gerbil wheel, that they don't see that, oh my, we have had this occur. So vision, very, very important. Things like developing vision. So I would ask you, do you ever read outside your field? Do any of you ever pick up a Healthcare Financial Management Association monthly journal? Or maybe you could ask your CFO, hey, when you get through with those, could you route them to me? How many of you have read something on finance lately? See, a lot of you are very, very consumed with your own areas. Some of you still have certain research interests, so you read the journals very heavily along those lines. Some of you have certain interests in certain clinical areas. You read everything you can. What am I getting at? What's one of the best ways to develop vision? Is to look outside of your box, right? You know, who saw the iPhone coming? Now, interestingly, you know, we've got a country full of companies who, interestingly, had vision, but didn't act upon it. What company had the first patent for digital photography? Kodak. How are they doing now? Since they were the pioneers in digital photography. And I can tell you 5, 6, 7 other stories, but my point is, folks, as you try to develop a compelling vision, a big part of that is developing it. How do you develop it? You've got to look outside your own world. You are experts and masters of your own world. So maybe you should tour FedEx factory, or FedEx distribution center. Atul Gawande got into a little bit of trouble talking about the Cheesecake Factory. Some of you are probably aware of that. A few years ago, he talked about the precision that the Cheesecake Factory restaurants are run upon. And the last year or so, you've probably seen some of these blogs have kind of poked at Dr. Gawande. I think unfairly so. But the concept to me is take a look outside your field. In 1985, I was trying to look for ways to better engage highly unionized service and maintenance workers. So I went and spent 2 days at the largest egg carton production facility in the world in Palmer, Massachusetts. Interesting. I came back full of ideas. Maybe you need to go to Disney. You know, they love to have you. They are making millions out of having us come to their organization and learn how they do it. They're not necessarily perfect, no, but they do things differently. So you also need to envision, bottom left, you need to then learn how to communicate it. See, that's sometimes the problem. You have a good sense of what's coming in the future. How do you communicate it? Because we're all resistant to change. We're all in the what's in it for me. And a big part of communicating vision is to try to get people to change things. You know, until we put dollars on reducing readmissions, our organizations didn't do a whole lot. It's fascinating to me as I contemplate some of the changes that are already here and will continue to come down the road. The ED in some respects may be the center of the acute care universe in terms of our shift to value-based payment. And I'm telling you something you know all too well. Then you communicate it, then the bottom left in that compelling vision, earning trust and loyalty. If you can communicate it effectively, if you can be persuasive, if you've got the right kind of relationship with your group, hopefully they will trust you to make that change. They won't resist the change. Change resistors typically are passive aggressive. So you have your meeting, you announce the change. Any questions? Dead silence. Okay, thanks folks, let's go to it. What do they go to it? They go back to the day-to-day, and they quietly resist that change. Now I know the EHR, the EMR was a real popular change, particularly with this group, and some are still living through it. My daughter works for a health system, and she's a manager of the continuum of care, and she goes, I think, this Thursday, Friday for her first 2 days of EPIC training. And they go 8 to 5:30, nonstop. Anyone been through EPIC training? Okay, all right. I told her she'd get through it. You know, it's not as bad as a root canal. Some disagreement there. So that compelling vision. So where do we start? We start at the top left, and I told you, you better know yourself better. You better pump up your self-awareness. We moved to the bottom left, and I said, you better get a sense of what's coming down the road. And we talked about how you can more effectively develop vision and enlist people's support. Now let's swing over to the bottom right, real way with people. So again, if you're simple, there's just 4 things you need to do. If you're a little more sophisticated, you can enlist with me and do the 16, okay? Your choice. So real way with people. Let's start at the kind of the top right, energizing staff. How many of you have worked for people who are just like, you think Sherry's ever like that? Sometimes it's just the way you present yourself. Amy Cuddy is a Harvard business professor. She's actually a sociologist, and she's written some really great stuff. And she's done a lot of really solid research. When I study leadership, I like to see at least some evidence-based studies. I still think there's a lot of art to leadership, but I think there's some science to it. So Dr. Cuddy basically says, hey, there's two things that are more important to anybody when they encounter a leader: warmth and trust. And she has shown it over 25 years of wonderful research, very, very solid research. So I'm going to hit the warmth piece because she spent some time on that, and her latest book talks about how do you engage some people. So does this engage? No. Does this engage? Are you with me? Do I have to come down? Ooh, getting close. You know, typically if this wasn't being filmed, I probably would spend most of my time on the floor. I don't ever always get all the way to the back. The two front rows are generally known as the spit zone, because you know, in a dry hotel and you get a little dry mouth. It's not because of nervousness, because I'm too stupid to be nervous. But so the first two rows are the spit zone. But I'm trying to engage you, so you don't. Or, you know, in the old days, you know, the back two rows, that was the USA Today row. You know, at least this is more polite, right? Don't you think? It's a lot more polite. So, energizing staff. How do you do that? Do you do that? Does it energize staff to just roar in and bark out the orders of the day? Un peu? Oui? Non français. Ein bisschen? Huh? No French or German people in here? Ah. Okay, we'll go back to English. Developing high-performing teams, which interestingly, as I was thinking about doing this for you guys, I thought, what I know about ED folks is you're pretty darn good at this already. You really are. EDs and ORs. Now, ORs, the teams are all kind of isolated silos. You ED folks, your silos aren't as strong as they are in the OR. But yeah, I'm biased about healthcare people. I believe in the tribe theory. And 97% of the time I'm dead right, 3% of the time I'm dead wrong. And if I could buy stocks and mutual funds based upon that, I would have had a great January and February. How's your 401k doing, by the way? Sorry. Then, kind of down there at 5 o'clock, the word mentoring. And many of you think mentoring means a formal mentoring program. No, I'm just talking about the day-to-day time that you take to take a new person. Maybe it's a highly qualified individual, highly experienced person that has just come into your area, and take them under the wing and help them out. You know, the nursing literature is full of the we eat our young kinds of stories. EDs, my experience, the ones I've been close to are generally pretty good at this, but probably could do a little more of it, because most of what you do is really more around the clinical processes. And then going down, moving past 5 o'clock, giving great feedback. I hate annual performance evaluations. That's not what we're talking about here. It's the whole idea. I do a lot of 1- and 2-day workshops, And typically in the one-day workshop at the lunch break, I really try to get around to people and say, am I doing what you want? Is the day going? Now, 7 out of 10 people are, oh, this is a great class. Yeah, well, it's a great class only because we're at the Marco Island Marriott. I could read my books to you in a monotone and you'd be happy to be at the Marco Island Marriott. We're much happier later today, And you've seen the people, at breaks they go and see the spouse and the kids. Oh, the smell of cocoa butter. And, at lunch they are kind of putting a little extra food and then all of a sudden they disappear and they don't eat with everybody else in the room. It's even worse if as the instructor, you're the only person eating lunch because everybody had to go check on spouse and kids. It's okay. We know why a lot of us go to these meetings. I don't take it personally. But as you think about giving great feedback, that's just something that's very important to me. It's very hard for me when I'm up here with the lights in my eyes. I'm relying a little on some of the folks here in the front row. It's hard for me to pick out enough eyes in the crowd to get my own feedback. How am I doing, or should I just move on? I generally don't like to talk at you, but I think, Sherry told me, well, this is what it is, so you do what Sherry tells you to do. And then finally, listening like you mean it. Andy came up with this phrase, and a couple of our reviewers said, that's too cutesy. They also said real way with people was a little cutesy. Mind you, we were trying to, at least in the original book, to have a little bit of evidence-based academic flavor to it. Andy actually used this book to get full tenure at Rush in 2005, interestingly enough. So I felt pretty good about that. Either that or the P&T committee was a little, you know how those go. So listening like you mean it. Second time I pulled it out. One of the greatest roadblocks to listening like you mean it. Or, don't you love it when you go into, I would like to hear Bob Edmondson's, the Tear in the C-Suite, or whatever the title it is. You're going to hear that Wednesday afternoon. Oh my, and I looked at his slides, they're great. So I'm in the C-Suite a lot, so that's hallowed territory, right? That's where real visions are developed and kind of communicated. Okay, so you're in that C-suite, so you're listening like you mean it. So most of them, you know what the healthcare design is. You've got the big desk, but then you've got the circle table. That's where 4 people can be seated, or if it's the CEO, 42 can be comfortably seated around the CEO's little conference table. You're not listening. 42 in the CEO, okay? So you're sitting around that little circular table. Every one of you have been at one of those. And whatever kind of sound the computer makes when the email comes in, bing, bing, whack, whack, whatever, our cell phones gave us those great noises. Do you really think that for a nanosecond, that biggity big that you're sitting with the kumbaya table with isn't thinking, oh crap, is that the board chair? He or she is not listening like he or she means it at that point. And some of you have done that too. So maybe I would question, do you even need the bing, bing, quack, quack? Do you need the sound on your work computer? Or really? Are you watching YouTubes all day at the work computer so you need the sound to watch the Beatles or Britney? Okay, bottom right. Sherry, I'm afraid they're going to scream refund. No. Throw the tomatoes first. Don't scream refund. So we're at the top right, Masterful Execution. And I'm going to start with generating informal power. And it's funny, Andy and I spent a lot of time wondering whether that competency belonged down with real way with people, and we finally concluded it was the masterful execution piece. And then I love this, and I've decided just to use it to show you that I'm just like you. Building TER consensus, what kind of consensus would that be? Do you see it? Is it a typo? I don't know. I don't know. So, generating informal power, building true consensus. So you're ready to implement. So you know yourself, you've got the vision, you've communicated it, you've got a real way with people, now you've got to execute the strategic plan, put some details to it. So these first two, informal power and true consensus, that's how you turn them loose. What has been shown to be, over the last 50 years, the single greatest source of satisfaction in a job? The number one source, the evidence. What's the number one primary source of job satisfaction? It's called personal control. And the academics have a word for it. It's called personal control theory. Now, I want you to think about it. What gives you satisfaction? So let me talk nursing a bit. You know, most nurses who take their first nurse leadership position across America, and I've got a number of studies that show this, essentially lose overtime, shift diff, other kinds of differentials, and typically take between a 10 and a 17% cut in annual pay. Gross W-2 from the last year they were a staff nurse, gross W-2 to the first year they were nurse manager. Wow, cut in pay. A lot of department heads in a typical acute care hospital. Think of the director of pharmacy. The hours that his or her pharmacist work, the hours that he or she works as a director. So think about your own situation. Think about why you have sacrificed to come to Vegas. Sacrificed by sitting in an uncomfortable chair in a dark ballroom without windows when it's 68, blue sky, and the birds are chirping outside. And you'll be here all day long. And at 6 o'clock, you will need the alcohol that Sherry promised you. And speaking of alcohol, have you noticed The Good Wife? Anybody watch The Good Wife? Have you noticed she's moved from red wine in past seasons to mixed drinks, and a couple times she stirred them with her finger. That's how I do it. It's like this. To just straight vodka. No ice. They're in their last 8 or 9 shows, so I think maybe she'll just drink herself to death. But at any rate, no rehab for that. So at any rate, think about it. Building true consensus, generating informal power, you do that by letting go. Your greatest source of satisfaction, folks, is your ability to control your calendar. And you say, oh, you don't know my calendar. No, you control it more than you used to. Your ability to control how you do things and what you do. You have a lot of personal control. The higher up in an organization people go, the greater their personal control. And for 50 years, we've had all kinds of very good research studies that never really made the popular press. Oh, yeah, they kind of did it. Employee engagement, physician engagement. And I was doing a physician engagement program about 5 weeks ago, and one of the CEOs said, yeah, that's the old-fashioned give the keys to the So yeah, they're not going to be engaged there. But this is all about turning it loose, making sure people have that vision, understand that vision, good feedback, ongoing day-to-day feedback. Let them do it. Let them do it. And some of you know this clinically. And then the top four, and I group them into 2 and 2, mindful decision-making and driving results. Have any of you ever taken a decision-making class? Shame on you. Have any of you ever read any articles or books on decision-making? Okay, we got a few. Good. I'd encourage you to enhance your knowledge base in this area. Then you can increase your competency in that. So, mindful decision-making, driving results. Now, clinical people are generally measurement-oriented people anyway. So you like science, you like math, you like numbers, you don't mind being measured. You quibble with different measures. Well, why wouldn't we? Some of them are crazy, but they are what they are. But that's part of masterful execution. And then the final two at the very top, kind of on either side of 12 o'clock high. Driving results and stimulating creativity. I'm sorry, stimulating creativity and cultivating adaptability. The ability to change, the ability to see that, oh, the vision isn't what we once thought it was, and you make mid-course adjustments. Probably the 2 competencies of the 16 that I would argue are the most difficult to develop and to grow. That's the model. To repeat, your top left, self-awareness. Who am I? Emotional intelligence. Compelling vision. Creating it, it's clear. There's a persuasiveness to it. A lot of times in our industry, we use the burning platform, compelling reason. Sometimes that gets old, but it is one. And then the third, a real way with people. About 8 years ago, this got a better reaction. Some of you are working too hard or living under a rock. And then finally, masterful execution, getting it done. I always like to say, here's the easy to remember list. Know yourself, Lao Tzu, nice statement here. See where healthcare is going, that vision. Strong people skills, all clinicians there. And then my favorite. You know, for those of you who think that the one on the left is a little too crude, deal with the little guy on the right. So now what you have through the rest of your book, some additional material, and then some dry, boring slides that I'm not going through. Some of you are sitting there thinking, oh my gosh, is he going to make it? Because there's 45, 50 slides left. They're there for you to read and enjoy somewhere down the road. I think I'm back with you for some other things later today. Thank you to the 80% who stayed with me. That was a good yawn. I like that. At least he yawned like this. So see you. Thanks for what you do. That's no BS for me. I mean it sincerely. I really do. Sherry, back to you.